Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place where we can talk about all sorts of awesome technology, open source, and have great conversations along the way. I'm super excited for my guest today. We were talking about all sorts of things before we got started, and I had to pause and say, let's talk about this on stream. So I'm super excited to bring on my guest. My guest is Matt from JetBrains. Matt, do you want to say hello?
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi Isaac again for the stream.
Yeah.
I work at JetBrains as a developer advocate. As a developer advocate, I think for about 3 years now. I started as a developer for ReSharper, and yeah, but for most part I stick with the .NET department. Although sometimes I also like to have some endeavors in, CI, DevOps, etc.
Yeah, great. One of the things I love to start our conversations with, Matt, is when we start to is kind of like origin stories for technologists, right? So, do you remember maybe not the first time you worked with tech, but maybe the first time you were working with tech? Maybe you were in university, or maybe you were even working when you came across open source, yeah, as a concept, and it interested you, like this idea of software that's just available for people to view and use and modify based on their needs.
I think the first contact I had with open source was, well, it wasn't during my university. My university was very much focused on the Java ecosystem. Um, in the middle, I already switched to C Sharp because I thought that was the much more interesting language. It looked nicer, and I already worked like part-time besides university. But when I applied for my master thesis, I had two strong. I had only two um, places I wanted to go, and that one company was developing in the open. It was a company in Austria. They have a framework which is called Remotion. Later, I also found that actually, don't let me lie, but I think the older version of Entity Framework was based on a part of that,
Okay.
which is called Relink. And yeah, my boss was basically the maintainer of that, and everything I did during my master thesis there was basically open source.
Okay.
So we were working on how to call it, so something like this dynamic proxy
Okay.
library. Uh, how's it called? Castle proxy, I think. And my part was about aspect-oriented programming. So you could say like a I don't know if Fodi existed at that time already, but my thing that I looked at that time was something like PostSharp, for
Sure.
instance. PostSharp
Okay.
definitely existed, and I also have to say, back then I had a talk with I have no idea how his name is pronounced, so sorry for that, but Gael, the owner of PostSharp, and that was really cool. And I just kind of realized how connected developers can be, although they're so far from each other, right?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think, you know, I would love to get your thoughts. You mentioned you were, thinking about open source in an academic sense, right? Like, I think one of the things that's very interesting about open source, a lot of people come to it as, whether they're learning or they're getting started in tech or they're using it in their day job as like a way to accelerate their role or their workflows, right? But from an academic sense,
Hmm.
like, I'm curious to get your thoughts on what is the general open source feeling in the academic world, right? You mentioned, working on it for your thesis, right? Like, when I was in
Hmm.
college, open source, like, it was a thing, obviously, but it wasn't as heavily utilized as it is today, I'd imagine, in most universities, right? I'm curious to know, like, your general feeling when you were working with open source, but it was doing it from like a research perspective.
From I don't know, for me, if I think back at the time of my studies, open source wasn't really didn't play a major role to me
Okay.
for some reason. I don't know why. Of course, we did research about it was very what I did was very. I mean, I'm not sure how this reflects in other countries, but in Germany there are two kinds of universities.
Sure.
One is more practical, and one is more theoretical. And I had the more theoretical one, although in part I also regretted that
Sure.
because doing stuff is much more interesting sometimes. And for that part, I mean, everything that was about researching papers, usually we had access to the ACM stuff, IEEE, etc.
Okay.
And the development part, that's also something that some people criticize about the theoretical universities in Germany. They don't actually prepare the students for work at actual, for the majority of jobs in at companies,
Sure.
because the majority of jobs is more about actually programming.
Yeah.
And this is you can kind of, I mean, you will get into that at some point, but it's not exactly the preparation that would be useful.
Yeah, no, I think that's kind of a fair comment on, I think, even in the United States too, where you have this idea of, are the things that are being taught in computer science curriculums, are they equating to being able to find jobs for recent graduates, right? I think a lot of I think the opinions are probably a mixed bag. I know a lot of people that have computer science degrees and they work in tech, but I also know a lot of people that don't have computer science degrees. Probably it's a majority, right? Sure, they might have information systems degrees, which are more like business oriented technology, which I think is super practical. But a lot of people just have, like, I've said this a few times, like, the most important thing in tech these days is problem solving skills, right? So, like, to your point about practical things, like being able to understand concepts and put them together to build meaningful things. I'm not saying that computer science principles aren't valuable, but it's one of those things where I have a general thought about, there has to be a happy balance, because most technologists and most developers these days, they don't like, I'm not going to say they don't care, but they're never going to be requested to like write like a very efficient sorting algorithm, or
That's true.
or writing, caring about efficiency and caring about the time complexity of different things, right? Like, these are things that are very important from a computer science perspective, but from a everyday developer perspective, it's maybe not as essential, right? So there's definitely a happy medium there, and I always am curious of if we can make computer science curriculums a bit, maybe to your point, have a more practical path and a more theoretical path. I think that there is some value in the theoretics, especially as you try to solve more complex problems. But to be completely honest, like 90% of the things I've done as a developer is like, here's a database, make this website that has this data from this database on this website, right? And it's a lot of the same boilerplate things over and over again.
It's true. I gotta say, it's hard for me to actually pinpoint that, and I do think some of that experience is very valuable, but it really pops out of nowhere sometimes. It's like, okay, I see this and that pattern. I remember, okay, there was something we actually discussed, and it slightly looks like that, and it's like the university gives you a toolbox of cool ideas that don't get outdated.
Sure. That's good. That's a fair way to describe it.
And regarding the point what you said about problem solving, I think this is something, I mean, retrospectively, I think university could have been a bit shorter. The one thing that really pushed me forward the most, that I feel personally, is the master thesis, because it was like pushing someone into the open water and let them be and get back to land, or I don't know, rescue yourself.
Yeah, learn how to swim, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting thought too, right? Where, I mean, there's been times where I've had to look into, okay, like what algorithm is going to be effective in this particular thing, right? Especially when you're thinking about things like compression or different things. But again, I guess my point is that there's been so many brilliant people before me that have figured most of it out. I mean, I don't, I'm not putting myself in the same, even box as people that are brilliant computer scientists. I'm not anywhere near that. But one of the things that I've been very successful with in my career is like you give me a problem and I'm able to solve it pretty quickly. I mean, even if it involves things that are outside of my scope of I guess acumen, because I guess I'm a very good Googler, right? I think I can Google search very well and I can Stack Overflow very well, which I think are very important for developers these days. Like being able to navigate Stack
It is
Overflow and
important.
GitHub, like when I talk to people that are getting started, the first thing that we always talk about is, okay, how can I be effective? How can I get a job easily? And it's a very hard question to answer, right? Because folks, like, you need a handful of different things, but I think the number one thing I always tell people is, like, if you can compartmentalize the different pieces to a problem and solve those individual pieces by themselves, you'll have success with anything, regardless if it's in tech or in business or whatever, right? Because problem solving is so important.
Yeah.
Also, you need a little bit of you need to be okay with a little bit of pain, because being a developer is very painful. A lot of negative feedback coming from what you're working on, right? Like, oh, this doesn't build. Oh, this
That's true.
breaks constantly. So you have to be ready for just failure after one thing after another. And then once you actually solve your problem, that's what's the payoff, and that's what drives you to do the next thing. And yeah, go ahead.
It's it it's a very problem focused. I mean, everyone surely knows that, but it's compared to other professions, it's a very problem focused thing.
Yeah,
I mean, like I don't know, plenty of friends, they have jobs where they basically can work like after following steps after another. But as a programmer, you have to always find it. Yeah, every little issue is a new adventure, more or less.
yeah. I think that's a really interesting thing to call out too, right? That especially, and I want to talk about you being like an open source maintainer, right? And because you have a fairly well known repository and a tool that you've built. I think one of the things that I always equate the problem solving thing to is it's not just the problems that we solve as developers. They're a lot of them aren't technology based, right? Like there are many situations that we run into just general, whether it be gaps in our way about doing things and the way how our brain operates. And when we try to solve problems that even don't involve technology, sometimes we try to do things in a way that might not be successful. And one of the things that segues me into wanting to talk to you about being a maintainer is, what drove you? What brought to your, I guess, what raised your passion enough to be a maintainer of an open source project and want to give back to the community in a way that was really beneficial?
Hmm. Um, I have to say, so Nuke is my second open source project, and I had one before, which was called TestFX, and it was a framework for building test frameworks, which sounds a bit like
It's pretty meta. It's
in
pretty meta.
seminary
Yeah.
or something, but it wasn't really successful. But I worked on that for about 3 years, and it was just interesting.
Yeah.
For me, I looked at it as some kind of research that I was doing. It was never done before, to my knowledge, because tests were written as statements on
Oh,
statement level.
okay.
So most just work on test method level, or like mspec on a type level. Um, but yeah, this was a bit different, and it was quite interesting. And it was really like a hobby, I didn't really the the incentive was not particularly to share with the community, although it
Yeah.
was open source. But I mainly was interested how people look at that, at those things, and to see what is possible,
Sure.
because it brought me also into a lot of spaces, like for instance, implementing plugins for IDEs. And yeah, it was, I think if you do something on your own where no one is talking to you and or directs you and how you should do it, this is a great
Yeah.
opportunity to learn something. And it doesn't immediately have to be super successful or something.
Yeah.
That I think I can say was the second project was more successful. And I you could, if you would look at the GitHub graph, probably you would see that my one project
Sure.
immediately went down and the other went up.
Yeah.
With a little time in between where I pushed to the repository while it was private. But the at that time the main reason for stopping the one and following the other was because I had so many ideas
Yeah.
in mind where I thought how I can make build automation for .NET
Sure.
better compared to the existing solutions.
Yeah.
And that was the moment when NUKE was born. I do actually remember one of my best friends saying, "You want to build a build system? Are you crazy?"
Sure. Yeah.
Because it sounds like and it also was, but it sounded like a huge task or a huge effort. But I somehow managed, I
Yeah.
would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I find very, very interesting about people that when they do build these open source tools, right? A lot of people, the origin story is I was either curious or I needed to build something for my job, and then it turned into something where you take a step back and you're like, oh, well, I imagine other people might appreciate this, right? I use my example, like I built a tool called Presence Light, which basically takes your team's presence and it pushes into different smart lights. So, and I built that because I like the idea of my family knowing like if I'm available or not, like they can come into the office
Mm-hmm.
or if they can't come into the office. And I quickly realized, especially now that everybody's working it from home more, there's an opportunity for a lot of other people to take advantage of it. So it was very much like solving a problem for Isaac that turned into solving a problem
Yeah.
for anybody who has a similar problem. And I imagine
Mm-hmm.
you probably ran into a similar thing with when you were building NUKE, right? Where you were curious about it and maybe you were looking at things from a different way than other build automation tools were, and then you quickly figured out like, oh, I have something here. Like this is something that a lot of people could take advantage of.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is very right. So put that into contrast with TestFX, the former project, I didn't well, I was dreaming.
Sure.
Let's put it this way.
Yeah.
I was dreaming that maybe someone would look at it, but that dreaming also stopped at a certain moment. With NUKE, I was probably initially I was quite sure that this is something that people would like, that would make people be curious about it, and the really the hobby for me is build automation is one part, but it is also about writing APIs. So writing APIs has traveled with me. I mean, the idea of writing them
Yeah.
has traveled with me during a couple of projects. For instance, with those aspect-oriented programming framework that I did at my company, plus the TestFX stuff. And I also learned from a couple of mistakes that I did there. So for instance, with TestFX, I realized that there's a certain limit on how far you can stretch Fluent APIs.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if you stretch them too far, they are not at all approachable by the user.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's probably a really fair point too, like getting back to like learning as a developer, right? There are certain constructs that initially seem very appealing because, I think Fluent is a great example where it's just so initially when you approach it's very comprehensible, right? Or or what's a good example? Like using just the extension model in general, where everything is kind of continuations upon each other. And what ends up happening is you can equate, like, you run into the situation where things become a bit unreadable and a bit impossible to understand because of the amount of obfuscation that you're, acting on. So I think there's an interesting point about, especially when it comes to build tools, right? Because you are obfuscating a lot of stuff with a build tool, right? Like this concept of like, oh, I just pass stuff into this black box and then that black box just gives me output, right? So, when you were going through the process of building a tool that does that, like, so what were some of the things that you came across that you initially thought like, oh, I didn't even know this was a problem. Like, I've never assumed that this particular problem existed inside of build tools.
At the moment I started with NUKE, I thought there were not a lot because from my past I already learned a lot about different other build tools. So for instance, I started with MS Build,
Yep.
and surely, but by now I barely remember. But with MS Build, I remember I wrote some tasks that also got merged into the MS Build extension package.
Okay.
I don't remember the name. What was his name? It was maintained by a single person. Fourier or something was his last name. And I realized a couple of things there. Others involved when we, for instance, switched to using PowerShell for our deployments at my previous company. PowerShell has a lot of unknown unknowns,
Sure.
some people call them, that you just find out over the time, and it's really it's not about using or implementing build systems and being confronted with the issues in build automation, but it is about actually using the tool, and that is preventing you from doing the actual work.
Yeah.
Right. And I wanted to kind of lower the bar regarding that. I wanted to have proper integration with a build system right from the start. And that is something that my previous boss taught me. Be as unsurprising as it can be. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what he meant by that is whenever you use an API, it should just tell the truth
Yeah.
how you write it. Yeah, and maybe sometimes also too much magic is bad.
Sure. That's
because
true.
you don't comprehend how the system works. So it's if you have, I think if you have to talk too much about the I mean, of course there are exceptions, and it really depends on the size of a project. But if let's stick to build automation systems, I think there really is not a lot that a user should know
Sure.
about a build automation system, because otherwise it gets way too complicated to use.
Sure. That's fair.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes to probably a lot of my personal thoughts about technology. Like, I love knowing how sausage gets made. Like, I love the idea of taking things apart, putting them back together, and like hopefully it still works, right? So, one of the things that I love about tools that are open source is that it gives me the ability to get a really strong understanding if I'm interested. On the effort that it takes to put together something, right? And as you go through something like NUKE, you can see that you've done a couple of things that I really appreciate as a developer, right? Like, one of the things that if you go to like the GitHub repo, you list out like all of the different CI tools that you test NUKE on, right? I think that's I think it's a really interesting approach, because it allows people that are new to NUKE or interested in using NUKE, like, okay, this is my CI system, like, will this thing work, instead of having to test it out myself. So, when you come up with ideas like that basically are trying to bring in user adoption, like, what are some of the things that you think about? Is it like, this is something that as a developer, if I come to a repo, this is the first thing that I look for? Or is it something as you were just making sure that your stuff worked on different platforms?
I think with particularly, I think it's a good idea, but particularly with those batches, and actually some of them are also red, but that is due to different reasons sometimes. Um, the batches for the different CI systems is first probably to show how it integrates with them. So
Yeah,
it's not just that the project runs of them, but also that it does proper collapsing of sections, like of build steps, for
sure.
instance. Um, and and also because a lot of other build systems kind of have set an example to showcase that. And of course, it absolutely makes sense for someone who has never heard or thought about build systems or build automation systems. Sorry, I sometimes
Sure.
mix
That's fine.
use it as an abbreviation.
Yeah.
Um, but for those, I think it's a good entry to see how it actually looks and to kind of feel a bit more how it would behave for them, because not everyone is using let's say GitHub Actions, not everyone is using
Yeah.
TeamCity. It's just a good thing to see this is how it would look, and that already gives you an impression if you might like it or not.
Yeah, I'm to continue on that. I'm curious as somebody who has probably played around with more CI or more CI systems than most people have. Most people just they have one because that's what either that's available for them for free or their employer specifies a particular one. Like, what are some nuances that you have came across when working with different tools? Like, because that's something that I think is very interesting, right? Because to your point, like people shouldn't know what these systems do because it's honestly it's not necessary. But as somebody who wrote a tool that needs to run effectively on all these different systems, like what is something that you've seen how some of these integration systems are implement things such as simple as like build scripts and things like that?
That's a really interesting question, and I often do wish that I would have more time actually writing things like this down.
Yeah,
But in the end, I rather stick with trying to be productive with the
sure,
project. But
that's fair.
there are a couple of things. So for instance, to begin with, Bitrise still shows red
Yeah.
for me, and that is the build on the and in particular, I have no idea. Maybe it's also my fault, but on the other systems it works.
Mm-hmm.
But on Bitrise, sometimes I have the quirks that not all processes get shut down. So the build actually has finished, but it times out due
Oh,
to the limit that they have set. Other quirks I have, like what's really interesting, and I also kind of work with the REST APIs
sure.
that those systems provide. And that allows me to send notifications to Slack.
Yep.
And so I have like a little dashboard that is sent to me by the Slack bot, and it's basically currently it's just 5 messages which get constantly updated. So every time I push something, it will edit the same message.
Sure.
Yeah. You could configure that differently so that you get a new message every time, but that is more like my personal
Yeah.
dashboard for the develop branch. And one thing that I noticed when I finally implemented that is, for instance, AppWare is the fastest provisioned CI service. So the Windows agents starts up really quickly. However, judging from performance, the GitHub Actions agents are a bit faster. And Ubuntu there is the fastest one to load up and also to finish.
Sure.
For AppWay, I recently discovered something that completely blew my mind, I have to say, unfortunately, and that was that if you have secrets and you print them out, like with just Echo, for instance, you define a secret through environment variables, like on any other system. Then I thought they get scrambled.
Sure.
But that's only true if you later look on the log. If
Mm.
you if you if you look at the live log, they're just
Sure.
plain
Yeah.
text. And I had that in my scripts. I mean, luckily I had no important secrets there. but I always print out the all
Yeah.
environment variables, and that is mostly for working with the project
Yeah.
because then I see what is currently set and I can diagnose issues much more easily. And most other, to my knowledge, all other CI systems scramble them even in live-log, and that is what I expect. And I have no idea why has chosen to scramble afterwards. I mean, that even makes less sense because why would you scramble afterwards?
Yeah.
It makes no sense to me. But they kind of have noted, and I didn't create the issue, but they have noted that this is intended behavior for performance reasons. I kind of have to accept that, but I usually try to like tell people, educate them about that, because it's not easy to discover.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to your point about like these are things that a typical developer should not have to care about, right? Because we're talking about
Right.
like 2 layers down. As a developer, I'm a C# developer. I'm writing some .NET project, and I'm using NUKE, and I happen to be using AppVeyor as my CI, and it's not working. And your initial response is, okay, well, why isn't it working? Is something wrong with my code? No. Is something wrong with like the build system? No, because it works on all the other platforms. Oh, so it works. It's an issue with the CI tool, right? So, I mean, that's a very interesting dilemma as a developer because the immediate response that I would take is like, okay, well, I'm not going to use AppVeyor anymore, right? Other developers, they might say, okay, well, I'm not going to use NUKE anymore. So depending on
Yeah.
how your approach is and how flexible you are in changing build tools or changing CI tools, like it's a decision that you have to make because you're responsible not just for one person's work, which would be the build automation author, which is you, but you're also responsible for AppVeyor's CI system, which is the responsibility of a lot of developers, right? I don't know how many people work at AppVeyor, but it's more than one, right? Um,
Sometimes to the outside, it
yeah,
feels like they also do a lot of customer support, let's
yeah,
say on GitHub, and sometimes it feels like it's actually just one. To be honest, I have
yeah,
no idea. Over the years I only have read about 2
sure,
names, but that's in total, and that is yeah. I don't know, but to your point, to make everything, I think that's worth mentioning because it's a very unique thing in Nuke to make sure everything runs on individual build
yep,
systems. Something that I came up with at some point was that this the CI configuration, the YAML
yep,
file, the in or the Azure pipelines file, or in TeamCity is the settings KTS file that you usually write with Kotlin, um, that can be generated from the C# implementation. And there's so much knowledge that can be taken from how you defined your build steps in C# to make the build pipeline configuration work more efficient.
sure,
So, for instance, in on TeamCity and Azure pipelines, you will be able to quite easily parallelize your tests. So let's say you have about 10 test projects, then you may choose, and that can be implemented with like 3 lines of code. Then you can allow Azure pipelines and TeamCity to parallelize
yeah,
those tests among, let's say, 2 different agents to cut half the execution time of your tests. On TeamCity, I went a step further even, and let's say you can parallelize among 10 agents, but then still you have kind of like the you would like to distribute them evenly, right?
yeah,
Because one test assembly might take 1 hour, while the other just take 10 minutes, and then you get the
yep,
idea. And there it would be possible, and I kind of will check if that's possible with other CI systems too. But you can get the previous test data, and therefore you can know which agent should execute which test
yeah.
projects. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like these are all things as a developer that we think about that are like the things that you don't think about as a developer, right? Like as a developer, I'm focused on like solving a particular problem, whether that be writing a web app that does some database crud or whatever, right? But in its essence, like I have these dependencies that that depending on my choices can make my life substantially easier, substantially harder, right? And one of the things that I really appreciate about people who build tools for developers, you being one of them, is you have to always have this mindset of probably from the point of view of different kinds of developers, right? Developers that are a bit more patient than others, or ones that are, I guess, more interested in throwing away things that they don't work initially, right? And that kind of goes into the next thing that I wanted to talk about is, the experience of being a maintainer, right? As somebody who, maintains a project that's of good size, like what has been your experience, working with the community, like issue building, PRs, general contribution, community engagement? How has that experience been for you?
It was quite all right, I can say.
Yeah.
Initially, I think initially, and I have no idea if that's a thing particularly just to build systems, but initially people were quite skeptical, and usually you get thrown arguments like not invented here syndrome and stuff like that, because sometimes people don't immediately see what you see as a problem. And of course, there might be this someone actually reinvents the wheel, but that I still don't see an issue with that, because it's like I said initially, it's a learning experience for everyone.
Yep.
And yeah, it was kind of in question, why do we need another build system? I quickly came up. I mean, initially I had two reasons specifically, and they kind of they grow over time also. So having that foundation that I would have missed with other systems made certain features that we have now only possible. Those would have not been possible with other systems. So because I was initially also asked, okay, why don't you just join forces with existing systems? But some systems have chosen a direction that is really that was even back then incompatible with what I was thinking of. And going forward a bit, I think it was quite hard to a certain extent to get people to actually try it.
Sure.
So it was. I do appreciate some people are really replied like, okay, I will more or less support the underdog, because they really know they understand this thing that competition is in the end good for everyone.
That's true.
Yeah, it is. Okay, not exactly for everyone. I will be honest with that. As a maintainer, it can be sometimes really a pain in the but from a user perspective, it's always I think it's always valuable to kind of look out for new ideas, to even let established products take new ideas from. Yeah. That is something that I love so much about our industry, and maybe I have a narrow view on that. If that's true, then I apologize. But I do think as software developers, we're having public bug trackers, for instance, and all that. We have gone a quite a large step forward already compared to other professions, because it's not like in many cases you don't necessarily have to know someone at a
reputation
established company.
Yeah.
Like for instance, with my video on demand subscription, that one that I have. I mean, it's a total nightmare to use that, and I sometimes call the hotline and tell them how they could improve, but
Sure.
I haven't seen that being taken into account over the years. Yeah, and yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
and yeah,
I mean, I think one of the things that that's interesting about being a maintainer is that the interaction that you with the community that you have is very hit and miss, right? It's one of those things where,
sure.
you know, and I'm guilty of it myself as somebody who leverages open source work all the time. Sometimes you forget that, you know, somebody is, in most cases, they're building a tool or they're building a set of tools in their spare time, because for the majority of people who work in who do open source work, it's not for their, you know, primary job. It doesn't make money for them. So, you know,
Hmm.
sometimes I get this feeling of people come to open source and they use it as a commodity, right? Like where, oh, I'm looking for let's just say I'm looking for an npm package that works with this particular, you know, construct. I find one. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, it's throw it into the trash and look for the next one, right? And when I say work is complete. That term is completely subjective, right? And one of the things
Hmm.
that I really like to talk about with maintainers is, you know, what drives you to continue to work on the project? Because there is this idea of maintainer burnout, right? So is it seeing the positives coming back from the community when you release a feature, or somebody new comes to your platform and they're like, "Oh, this is awesome. Thank you so much for working on this." Like, what drives you to continue to build NUKE?
Probably that has well, initially I had really high hopes, and I hope I don't sound arrogant or anything. But when I started, I had high hopes and strong beliefs in that. Over the years, I think at the beginning until the middle, probably, I was very open to basically anyone
Sure.
who went through the door.
Yep.
I kind of made their problems mine. I tried to look for how can the larger community benefit from solving their particular issue, and I think that is also in the end what people like about Nuke
Yep.
these days.
Yeah.
That it's like an actual framework that you can use, and that it solves many of the common issues in a, yeah, I would say smart way, but everyone can make their own how to say opinion about that.
Yeah.
Um, but in the middle, and I really felt that it was last year when I moved apartments. There was one time when, and maybe it was my situation
Yeah.
or current feeling at that particular moment, but I remember I was in the process of moving apartments, and there was an issue. I pushed out a new hotfix release, and that broke some for some people. And it was that 4 or 5 different people created that issue, and each adding their own log, which basically said the same thing. And I was kind of annoyed because I thought like, okay, come on, people,
Sure.
you can see that the original issue already mentions that exact same thing that you just repost, and I had notifications enabled and was constantly pinged basically, and I was really annoyed. And retrospectively, maybe I also did a wrong thing, and I kind of said, okay, can you please turn on your brain? Yeah, I tried to be still yeah, not insulting, of course, but I was kind of angry, and in the end that led to me, yeah, deleting all the irrelevant
Sure.
things, and people also jumped a bit at me, and that was a very unpleasant experience, because I kind of, as a maintainer, I kind of expect, or my presumption basically is that that those coming already make a benefit of using the system. Yeah. And if not, if there are new users, I think there's better places to ask. Like we also have a Slack channel, and there are other people. Yeah, because that approach of me answering all the questions purely doesn't scale. And yeah, I after that experience, it took me a while. I actually took a break of like 2 months or so during that time also, and that came after me as well, because some also said, okay, this is not something you can rely on, and that is all based on people who have never contributed before. And yeah, I don't know, it's a lot of baggage that people automatically sometimes, of course. I also had a lot of, we'll talk about that too. I also had a lot of good experience.
Sure.
But some people just expect that you're solving their problems for you. Yeah, and it's not just me. I remember Jeremy Skinner, for instance, talking about fluent validation, saying that probably, and I hope I remember correctly, but a majority of the issues he has to deal with is not particularly sourced in Fluent validation. It's in user code. Yeah.
Sure.
And it's easy for a person to just go out and think, okay, let's post my issue there, and I go to lunch and come back and it may be solved. Yeah. But that puts the energy loss onto someone else. That's not right.
Sure.
I think.
Yeah.
But your question was also what drove me going forward. So during that time, I met a lot of very nice people that I can call my friends these days, and quite good friends actually. And I think they're part of that. So even though over a particular time I was the sole maintainer, I announced my best friend's second maintainer now, because he's not particularly well active with the project, but we discussed a lot about the project over the years. And so whenever I get hit by a bus, he's the best person.
Sure.
He's the best person that could take over the project. And meanwhile, he's also back in .NET development, because he was in front-end development for a while.
Okay.
But yeah, these friends really, some of them I can't wait to meet them in real life.
Yeah.
So, some of them I have already met in real life. Like that one person from his name is Todor from Bulgaria, and I have to say, and I hope he might be watching at least afterwards, but I have to say when I first met him on the chat, I was like, I had the same feeling with many of the other users that come across and say, I'm interested in approaching this. This happens quite frequently, but no one. It's more rare that people stick to their own goals. I mean, when they say they want to work on something. But anyway, I had the same feeling with him, but I'm still quite neutral to these things. And at one point, we found out that his colleague is working in the same city like me, and then his colleague asked me if I may be interested having dinner together, and he pulls out a large amount of stickers for NUKE, so that he in Bulgaria printed with a friend, and they kind of shipped that to me.
Oh, fun.
Here, and yeah, and that's a moment of proper appreciation from the community.
Yeah.
This is not something that would happen out of, I don't know. It surely doesn't happen often.
Yeah.
And I haven't seen it like, no idea.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's why to be honest, like people treat tech as a community, right? So like when you find, I use the phrase your people a lot. When you find your people, like when you find people that you can have a conversation with inside of tech and outside of tech, and you just enjoy their company, like that's the reason to keep going forward, right? I think, and that equates as well with, owning or maintaining a repository of tools or of software, right? Like you'll find people that'll come across you and they're just fans. Like they love the work that you're doing, and that's what's super impactful. And those people that initially were customers of yours to an extent are now your friends because a tool that you work on in your spare time was the connecting point, was the conduit for the relationship. I mean, that's super impactful because you have shared experience, there's already like a positive experience on both ends. Like you wrote a tool that person loves, and that person lets you know they loved it, right? So you immediately have gratification in the relationship. So that's perfect. I think as well, like as we're starting to wrap up, one of the things I really like to talk with folks about too is I know that you do a lot of open source stuff in your spare time, but you also do a good amount of open source stuff in your work life as well, right? You want to talk a little bit about the open source work that you're fortunate enough to do at your employer?
Yeah, sure. So like I said before, I work in the .NET department advocacy, and for us, actually, advocacy usually involves also producing a lot of content. Yeah, and I often also stick to just the programming part. Sometimes, I mean, it's hard to find a good balance between those. But what I do frequently and working on in the wild is all the different plugins that we have for Rider, our .NET IDE, and ReSharper, which is the extension for Visual Studio. And that happens all in the open. Well, sometimes I also try to send pull requests to projects I might be involved with. But something actually pretty new, and that's probably also interesting for you. There is a new program that we in the team try to establish at JetBrains, which is called the OSS Power Ups program. So so far I've done 2 episodes of that, and we had Jeremy Skinner on it, and with Fluent Validations. And since we were at the Fluent stuff already, second episode was about Fluent assertions with Dennis Duman. The next episodes are going to be about Silk.net, which is a graphics related library. And after that, the next one actually will be about Snoop. So that's like a debugging program for your WPF applications. And that's I think this is a really cool program. At least I hope that people like it. But particularly, I have to say that the most interest I have, or we have, with that program is to support the maintainers. Yeah, and that is first by giving them a platform to talk about their projects, but also from my own experience, I know that just providing a platform and getting more famous is usually, well, it's helping you in the sense that you get more issues created in your bug tracker.
Yeah.
And
more visibility isn't always a good thing, right? More visibility is not always a good thing.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like I said before. Initially, I could probably give an answer to all the issues that were thrown at me. I can't do that these days anymore. Sometimes I get like 5 messages per day in the Slack channel, and I gotta be honest. I also I now request for issue creators to be a sponsor, at least the minimum of something like $5. And if someone needs, I do give like a short answer of what I can think if someone comes with an issue in the Slack channel. I give a brief thought that I have,
Sure.
but if it needs to get deeper, I ask people to consider one-time
Yeah.
sponsorship
Yeah.
to, like spend 50 minutes. That is sometimes already enough,
Yeah.
but like I said, it's not possible to care about everyone's problems.
That's very
But
true.
going back to the open source power ups thing. So the first is giving them a platform. And while we do so, we also mention all like you do in this format, mention the issues that maintainers
Yeah.
have. That I think one of my colleagues, they had an interview, and she said that a couple of $billion is saved from companies because they use open source,
Yep.
and that's kind of a shocking number looking at the creative minds that sit behind those projects, and sometimes it's I mean they should receive more care than they actually receive. Yeah. A second thing that we do is we are providing them with a sponsorship for about a year,
Oh, okay.
and it doesn't need to be used by us actually. So Fluent validation, to my knowledge, we don't use it inside our code. I would be surprised if so. Fluent assertions, I think also not. And the third thing that we try to do is to give some, very specific personal support. For Fluent validation and Fluent assertions, it was creating a dedicated Rider ReSharper plugin, which adds a couple of inspections and analysis, code analysis. For Snoop, it will be something also interesting because Snoop is usually used on user PCs, so someone that doesn't necessarily have Visual Studio or something installed, and but you can still like get insights into these
Yeah.
WPF applications, and uh, and the maintainer also, just yesterday we had a short talk. He actually said, yes, we do have a couple of requests that it chokes up on the virus scanner or something, Windows Defender, etc. And it would be great to have it code signed. So I currently trying to pull in my old company, which nowadays has a code signing platform, and we try to get the certificate from them, and I will
Sure.
just I will try to implement the code signing pipeline
Yeah.
then. Yeah.
That's great. I think, as we wrap up, I think that's, one of the things that I love to see is, the work that, companies do to sponsor and to promote open source, right? It sounds like JetBrains is doing that. I work at Microsoft. One of the things that I do in my spare time as I work on the .NET Foundation's marketing committee. So we have programs that we're always trying to amplify projects that are part of the foundation. And I think that these things are really, really impactful because it shows open source maintainers that there is support for you, not just this, to mention earlier, it's not just people coming and opening up issues. Like if you bring value to the community, you're going to be rewarded for it. So, as we close, Matt, I want to thank you so much for your time. I think this conversation has been super, super awesome. I look. It's funny because before you and I started talking, I was like, I'm gonna look at the clock and be like, oh, we gotta wrap up, and that is that time, right? I think one of the things that I think is super exciting too about what you're doing is you're basically your communication channels between the people that use your tools and follow you are you're very open, and I really appreciate you coming on to talk about all sorts of things, and especially what it's like to be a maintainer, because sometimes it's challenging. And I want to thank you for coming on. And as we close, one of the things that I love to ask my guests is if you can think of open source or technology and think of one word and how it means to you, like what would that word be for you?
So, sorry, for a moment I lost my
No,
thought
that's fine.
because what I wanted to say, I also have to thank you, and I
Yeah,
find it interesting that we thank each other because this was a really interesting
sure.
conversation, and and I appreciate everyone who also draws focus onto open source development, and it's just I can't say how much I appreciate it. So
Yeah.
now I need the question.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Thank you for thanking me. I'm always a fan of getting thanked for stuff. I mean, so yeah, when you think of open source, when you think of technology in general, and your experiences, like, what is the first word that comes to mind?
That's a hard
It
question.
always, it's funny because it's just one word, but it's challenging.
I have no idea, to be honest.
That's fine. You know,
It's so loaded.
that's fine. Like one of the things, so for example, like I've had people use the term community or collaboration. Other folks have used like, things like exhausting or challenging. I think one of the things that it really drives home is that open source means something different to everybody. And I think it's really impactful. I think that's the only way to describe it for me, at least.
Okay, let me try to find a
Sure,
word.
no
I
problem.
think mm, I think it's about, yeah,
Yeah,
collaboration. It's also a bit of dreaming for me, I
dreaming.
think.
That's a good one. I like that.
Yes, sometimes it is because, particularly because many projects don't start with being like, backed by a huge company
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah,
something. It's something that starts small, and you kind of see how it grows, how it becomes mature, and there are so many ideas that I had when I just started, and 4 years later I finally can implement them, and that's I actually had when I started. Meanwhile, I closed them because I still remember them, but I had some issues open which had the visionary tag on them, because I thought, okay, this is something I can't do now, but I have those dreams, and this is where I at some point would like to be.
sure.
And yeah, so dreaming, although it's yeah,
Yeah, no, I mean
it
that.
would be my second
I think,
choice.
yeah, I think I've never heard dreaming yet, and I think that actually equates very well to me because it's one of those things where, yeah, like this is something that wouldn't be made possible without a lot of work of a lot of other people, right? So there are
Mhm.
times where you're like, things shouldn't be. You have this kind of out of body experience, right? That I equate to dreaming, and I think that's a great example of just what open source can mean to folks. So I think that's a great option too. Collaboration, communication is
Mhm.
also very good. So again, Matt, I want to thank you so much for coming on. For folks that
Thank you too.
yeah that want to follow Matt, it's at Matt. Is it Koch? Do you go by Koch or Coach?
In German it's Koch,
Koch.
but it's I know it's not.
Nope,
Yeah,
nope.
you
Pronounce it the
do a
right
good
way.
job.
Matt Koch 87 on Twitter. He's also on GitHub, I believe, under the same alias. Take a look at some of the stuff he's working on. Follow him. He's telling great stories, which I love to promote people that are doing that. For the folks that tuned in,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for checking us out today. This will go up on YouTube later today. Thank you so much again, Matt, for your time, and thank you everybody. Take care.
Bye bye.